Good evening all and welcome back to Untold Fears. Tonight we are diving into the darkest depths of the cruise industry with 10 most disturbing true cruise ship human trafficking horror stories. These accounts come from passengers, crew members, and survivors who witnessed something on the high seas that forever changed their understanding of these floating cities. What makes these stories particularly chilling is their authenticity. Each case is built from documented reports, survivor testimonies, and investigations that reveal how traffickers exploit the anonymity of international waters and the complex jurisdictions that make rescue nearly impossible. According to recent Department of Transportation data, survivors report being trafficked through cruise ships at alarming rates, with 7% of trafficking victims relocated during their exploitation by cruise vessel. These are not tales of maritime adventure gone wrong, but real accounts of modern slavery happening behind the luxury facades of billion-dollar ships. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Untold Fears for daily true horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Now, let us step aboard these vessels of terror, where paradise becomes prison and the endless ocean becomes the perfect cover for humanity's worst crimes. This happened in March of 2019 aboard the Royal Majesty, a luxury cruise ship that operates routes between Miami and the Caribbean. I was working as a guest services coordinator at the time, and what I witnessed over the course of that 7-day voyage changed everything I thought I knew about the cruise industry. The events I am about to share still haunt me, and I have never spoken about them publicly until now. The Royal Majesty was one of those massive ships that could hold over 4,000 passengers and nearly 2,000 crew members. Most guests never really think about the crew beyond their interactions with waiters and housekeeping staff. They see their polished uniforms and friendly smiles during service, but they have no idea what happens in the crew quarters deep below the passenger decks. I wish I could say I was completely ignorant of this world too, but my position required me to occasionally coordinate with crew management, so I had seen glimpses of how the other half lived. On the second day of the cruise, I received a guest complaint that caught my attention. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman traveling alone in a mid-tier cabin, called the guest services desk around 10 o'clock in the morning. She was frustrated because her room had not been cleaned in over 24 hours and she had not seen her assigned cabin steward since embarkation. This was unusual because our Filipino cabin stewards were known for their exceptional service and attention to detail. They took pride in their work and disappearing without notice was completely out of character. I checked the crew roster and found that her assigned steward was listed as Roberto Santos, a 23-year-old from a small village outside Manila. According to his file, Roberto had been working for the cruise line for 8 months and had received consistently excellent reviews from both passengers and supervisors. There were no disciplinary issues, no complaints, and no indication that he would simply abandon his duties. I tried contacting him through the crew communication system, but there was no response. My first assumption was that Roberto might be ill and had simply failed to report his absence properly. I decided to visit the crew quarters to check on him personally. Getting access to the crew areas required special clearance, which I had due to my coordination responsibilities. The crew quarters were located on deck 2, far below the passenger areas, and the contrast was stark where passenger decks featured marble floors and elaborate decorations. The crew areas had narrow hallways with industrial lighting and the constant hum of machinery. I found Roberto's quarters, a small shared cabin that he occupied with 3 other Filipino crew members. When I knocked, one of his roommates answered. The man, whose name was Carlos, looked nervous. When I introduced myself and asked about Roberto, Carlos claimed he had not seen Roberto since the previous evening, which contradicted the work schedule that showed Roberto should have been cleaning cabins that morning. When I pressed for more details, Carlos became visibly uncomfortable and kept glancing down the hallway as if he was afraid someone might overhear our conversation. I decided to speak with Maria, a housekeeping supervisor who worked closely with the cabin stewards. Maria had been with the cruise line for over 5 years and knew all the Filipino crew members personally. When I asked her about Roberto, her expression changed immediately. She pulled me aside and spoke in a low voice, telling me that Roberto had been asking questions lately about his contract and pay. Apparently, Roberto had discovered that he was being charged for food, accommodation, and uniform costs that were supposed to be covered by the cruise line. His monthly salary of $800 was being reduced to less than $200 after these deductions. Maria explained that Roberto had become increasingly upset about the working conditions. He was required to work 14-hour days with no breaks, 7 days a week for the duration of his 10-month contract. He had no access to the passenger areas except when working, and he was not allowed to leave the ship at port stops unless he was on official business. Most disturbing of all, his passport had been confiscated by crew management upon joining the ship, supposedly for safekeeping, but he had been unable to get it back despite multiple requests. The more Maria told me, the more concerned I became. She described a system where Filipino crew members were essentially trapped on the ship, working in conditions that bordered on slavery. They had signed contracts in the Philippines that promised good wages and opportunities for advancement. But the reality was very different. Many of them had paid recruitment fees to agencies back home, putting them in debt before they even started working. The cruise line then used this debt combined with the confiscated passports and isolation at sea to maintain complete control over the workers. That afternoon, I decided to do something that was probably beyond my authority. I accessed the ship's manifest system to track Roberto's movements. What I found was deeply disturbing. According to the system, Roberto had been transferred off the ship during our stop in Nassau the previous day. However, there was no record of where he had been transferred to and no documentation of the reason for his removal. The transfer had been processed by someone in crew management. But when I tried to contact that department, I was told that personnel matters were confidential and none of my business. I spent the rest of the cruise trying to find out what had happened to Roberto. I spoke with other Filipino crew members, but they were all too frightened to give me detailed information. They would only speak in whispers and always made sure no supervisors were around. What I learned painted a picture of systematic exploitation and abuse. Workers who complained about conditions or asked too many questions about their contracts often disappeared. Sometimes, they were told they were being transferred to other ships, but crew members suspected that many were simply abandoned at foreign ports with no way to get home. On the final day of the cruise, I received a message that chilled me to the bone. One of Roberto's roommates slipped me a note during the disembarkation process. The note was written in broken English, but the message was clear. Roberto had been taken to a cargo hold on deck 1 during the Nassau stop. He had been told he was being transferred to another ship, but when Carlos went to look for him later, the cargo hold was empty except for some of Roberto's personal belongings scattered on the floor. The note went on to describe what Carlos believed had happened. According to him, crew members who became problematic were sometimes handed over to trafficking networks that operated in Caribbean ports. These networks would take the workers and force them into labor on fishing vessels or in remote locations where they could never escape. The cruise line benefited because they could eliminate troublesome workers without having to pay for their return transportation to the Philippines. The trafficking networks benefited because they acquired workers who were already isolated and had no legal recourse. When I tried to report what I had learned into the ship's security department, I was told that Carlos was probably making up stories because he was upset about his working conditions. The security chief suggested that Roberto had simply jumped ship in Nassau and was probably working illegally somewhere in the Bahamas. He warned me to stop asking questions about crew personnel matters, and he made it clear that my job could be in jeopardy if I continued to interfere with operations. After we returned to Miami, I attempted to follow up on Roberto's case through official channels. I contacted the FBI, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and even the Philippine consulate. However, because Roberto had been documented as a voluntary transfer, and because the incident had occurred in international waters and Bahamian territory, determining jurisdiction was complex. Each agency I contacted referred me to another agency, and eventually I was told that without more concrete evidence of wrongdoing they could not open an investigation. I learned later that Roberto Santos was not an isolated case. A former crew manager who had left the cruise industry contacted me several months after the incident. He told me that the exploitation of Filipino workers was endemic throughout the cruise industry and that workers who demanded their rights or tried to organize for better conditions often faced retaliation. Some were blacklisted from future employment while others simply disappeared during port stops. The cruise lines maintained plausible deniability by using third-party recruitment agencies and subcontractors who handled the dirty work. The former crew manager also explained how the system worked to trap workers. The recruitment agencies in the Philippines would charge workers substantial fees for the opportunity to work on cruise ships. These fees, often amounting to several months' salary, put workers in debt before they even left home. Once on board, workers found that their actual wages were much lower than promised and that they were charged for expenses that should have been covered by the cruise line. With their passports confiscated and no way to leave the ship, workers had no choice but to continue working under these conditions. What made the situation even more tragic was that many of these workers came from desperately poor families who depended on the money they sent home. The workers knew they were being exploited, but they felt they had no choice but to endure the abuse because their families were counting on them. This economic desperation made them perfect targets for traffickers who promised better opportunities on other ships or in other countries. I eventually left my position with the cruise line because I could not continue to be part of an industry that I knew was built on exploitation. I tried to stay in touch with some of the Filipino crew members I had met, but many of them stopped responding to my messages. Those who did respond told me that conditions had not improved and that workers were still disappearing under suspicious circumstances. Roberto Santos was never found and his family in the Philippines was never given a satisfactory explanation of what happened to him. According to the cruise line's official records, he completed his transfer successfully and was no longer their responsibility. His family hired a lawyer to investigate, but without evidence of what actually occurred, they had no legal recourse. The last I heard, Roberto's mother was still waiting for her son to contact her, not knowing that he had likely become another victim of the human trafficking networks that operate in the shadows of the cruise industry. The most haunting part of this experience was realizing how easily it had happened and how many people must have known what was going on. From recruitment agencies in the Philippines to crew managers on the ships to port authorities in Caribbean destinations, there were multiple points where someone could have intervened to protect Roberto and others like him. Instead, a system of willful ignorance and plausible deniability allowed traffickers to operate with impunity, using the anonymity of international waters and the vulnerability of desperate workers to build their criminal enterprises. Even now, years later, I cannot board a cruise ship without thinking about the workers in the crew quarters below, behind every perfectly cleaned cabin, every friendly greeting from housekeeping staff. There may be someone who is trapped in conditions that amount to modern slavery. Roberto Santos may be gone, but his story serves as a reminder that human trafficking does not only happen in dark alleys or remote locations. Sometimes it happens in plain sight on luxury ships full of tourists who have no idea that their vacation is built on the suffering of others. This happened during a Caribbean cruise in October of 2021, and I still cannot believe how close I came to witnessing something that would have destroyed multiple lives. I was a passenger on the Ocean Dreams, a mid-sized cruise ship that operated week-long itineraries through the Eastern Caribbean. What started as a routine vacation turned into a nightmare when I accidentally stumbled upon a human trafficking operation that was using our ship as a transportation vessel for their victims. I should explain that I work in social services back home in Chicago, so I am trained to recognize signs of exploitation and abuse. This background made me more observant than the average passenger. But even with my experience, what I witnessed was so brazen and sophisticated that it took me days to fully understand what was happening. The cruise had been routine for the first 3 days. We visited St. Thomas and St. John, did the usual tourist activities, and enjoyed the ship's amenities. It was on our stop in Barbados that things began to feel wrong. I was exploring the port area around 4 o'clock in the afternoon when I noticed a small group of young women near the cruise terminal. They appeared to be in their late teens or early 20s, and something about their demeanor caught my attention. The women were dressed in cheap clothing that did not fit properly, and they looked exhausted and confused. They were accompanied by 2 well-dressed men who seemed to be giving them instructions in a language I could not identify. What struck me odd was that the men were not treating the women like tourists or even cruise passengers. There was a clear power dynamic where the women appeared to be afraid of the men and were nodding submissively to whatever they were being told. I watched from a distance as the group approached the cruise ship's gangway. The men presented documentation to the security staff, and after a brief conversation, the women were allowed to board the ship. However, they did not go through the normal passenger boarding process. Instead, they were escorted to a service entrance that I had not noticed before. The men remained on the dock and watched until the women disappeared into the ship. My social worker instincts told me that something was wrong with this situation. Young women being escorted onto a cruise ship by men who did not accompany them was unusual enough, but their body language and the secretive nature of their boarding process raised serious red flags. I decided to keep an eye out for these women during the remainder of the cruise. That evening at dinner, I spotted one of the women working in the ship's main dining room. She was dressed in a server uniform and was taking orders from passengers, but she looked terrified and kept glancing nervously toward the kitchen area. When I tried to make eye contact and smile at her, she quickly looked away and seemed to shrink into herself. This behavior was completely different from the friendly and professional demeanor of the regular crew members. I began paying closer attention to the service staff over the next 2 days and gradually identified 3 of the women I had seen boarding in Barbados. They were all working in different areas of the ship, one in the dining room, one in housekeeping, and one in the spa. What struck me as unusual was that none of them appeared on the ship's crew roster that was posted in the passenger areas, and they did not wear the standard name tags that all other crew members displayed. The breakthrough came on the 5th day of the cruise when I witnessed an incident that confirmed my suspicions. I was on deck 7 around 10 o'clock in the evening when I heard raised voices coming from a service corridor. Through a partially open door, I could see one of the men from the Barbados dock arguing with a ship's officer. The conversation was in English, and I could hear enough to understand that they were discussing payment for services and threatening consequences if certain arrangements were not maintained. The ship's officer was clearly uncomfortable with the conversation and kept looking around to make sure they were not being overheard. The man from the dock was more aggressive and was gesturing toward what appeared to be a cabin key. He mentioned something about the women needing to be available for special requests from passengers and that the ship's staff needed to cooperate with these arrangements or face serious problems. I realized then that I was witnessing a human trafficking operation in progress. The women had not been brought aboard as legitimate crew members or passengers. They had been trafficked onto the ship and were being forced to work in both official ship jobs and unofficial services for passengers. The men from the dock were their traffickers and they had corrupted ship's personnel to facilitate their operation. The most disturbing part was understanding how the system worked. The traffickers would recruit vulnerable women in port cities with promises of legitimate work on cruise ships. These women, often from impoverished backgrounds with limited education, would be told they could earn good money working in hospitality jobs while traveling to different countries. Once they were aboard the ship, their documentation would be confiscated, and they would be forced into a combination of unpaid labor and sexual servicing of passengers who paid extra for these illegal services. The cruise ship provided the perfect cover for this operation because it operated in international waters where jurisdiction was unclear and it moved between different countries where local law enforcement had limited ability to investigate. The traffickers could bring women aboard at one port and remove them at another, making it nearly impossible for authorities to track their movements or build cases against the operators. I spent the rest of the cruise trying to figure out how to help these women without putting them in greater danger. I attempted to approach one of them directly, but she became visibly panicked when I tried to speak with her privately. She kept shaking her head and looking around frantically, clearly terrified that someone would see her talking to a passenger. I realized that any direct intervention could result in severe punishment for her. On the final day of the cruise, I made the difficult decision to contact the ship's security department. I explained what I had witnessed and provided details about the men from Barbados and the suspicious boarding process. The security chief listened to my concerns, but was dismissive of my allegations. He suggested that I had misunderstood what I was seeing and that the women were legitimate crew members who had joined the ship in Barbados as temporary workers. When I pressed him for more information about the boarding procedures and why these women were not listed on the crew roster, he became defensive and suggested that passenger concerns about crew matters were not appropriate. He made it clear that he did not want me to continue asking questions about the situation, and he warned me that making false accusations against the ship's operations could result in legal consequences for me. After we returned to Miami, I contacted the FBI and reported what I had witnessed. The agent I spoke with took my report seriously and asked detailed questions about the timeline of events and the individuals involved. However, he explained that investigating crimes that occurred in international waters and involved multiple jurisdictions was extremely complex. Without physical evidence or cooperation from the victims, building a case would be nearly impossible. The agent also informed me that human trafficking through cruise ships was a known problem that law enforcement agencies were trying to address. Traffickers had identified cruise ships as ideal vehicles for moving victims between countries because the ship's legitimate operations provided cover for their criminal activities. The international nature of cruise operations also made it difficult for any single law enforcement agency to maintain consistent oversight. Several months later, I learned more about the scope of the problem through my work in social services. A colleague who specialized in human trafficking cases told me that the Caribbean cruise routes were particularly popular with traffickers because of the number of impoverished islands where vulnerable women could be easily recruited. The promise of work on luxury cruise ships was especially appealing to young women who had few other economic opportunities. The trafficking networks had become sophisticated in their operations, often working with corrupt individuals within the cruise industry to facilitate their activities. Some crew members were bribed to look the other way, while others were actively recruited to help with the trafficking operations. The cruise lines themselves often claimed ignorance of these activities, but the systematic nature of the operation suggested that at least some company personnel had to be aware of what was happening. What made the situation even more tragic was that the victims often came from backgrounds where they had been told that working on cruise ships was a legitimate path to a better life. Many had families back home who were counting on the money they expected to send back. When they discovered the reality of their situation, they were trapped not only by their traffickers, but also by their own shame and fear of disappointing their families. The women I had seen in Barbados were likely just a small part of a much larger network that moved victims throughout the Caribbean, possibly to other regions. Each cruise ship stop represented an opportunity for traffickers to pick up new victims or transfer existing ones to different operations. The constant movement made it nearly impossible for the women to seek help or for law enforcement to track their movements. I never learned what happened to the specific women I encountered during that cruise. The FBI agent told me that even if they were able to identify and rescue trafficking victims, many were reluctant to cooperate with law enforcement because they had been threatened with violence against themselves or their families. Others feared deportation or prosecution for crimes they had been forced to commit while under the control of their traffickers. The experience fundamentally changed how I view the cruise industry and highlighted the dark realities that can exist behind the facade of luxury vacation experiences. While thousands of people enjoy cruise vacations safely each year, the industry's complex international operations and limited oversight create opportunities for criminals to exploit vulnerable individuals. The women I witnessed being trafficked onto that ship were hidden in plain sight, serving drinks and cleaning cabins while being held in conditions that amounted to modern slavery. This case taught me that human trafficking is not just something that happens in distant countries or shadowy underground operations. It can happen on luxury cruise ships filled with families on vacation, facilitated by criminals who have learned to exploit the gaps in international law enforcement and the willingness of some individuals to look the other way when money is involved. The women from Barbados deserve better, and their stories serve as a reminder that we all have a responsibility to remain vigilant and speak up when we witness exploitation, even when doing so is difficult or uncomfortable. Music. This happened during the summer of 2022, when I was working as an entertainment coordinator aboard the Paradise Explorer, one of the largest family cruise ships in the Caribbean fleet. What I discovered in the ship's youth program still haunts me today, and I am only speaking about it now because I believe the public has a right to know what can happen to children on these supposedly family-friendly vessels. I had been hired to coordinate activities for teenagers aged 13 to 17, which meant I worked closely with the entire youth services department. The ship carried up to 5,000 passengers on 7-day cruises, and during peak season, we would have over 800 children enrolled in various youth programs. On the surface, everything appeared professional and well organized. We had extensive facilities, including game rooms, teen lounges, kids clubs, and even a dedicated youth deck with pools and activities. The youth services department employed about 30 staff members who were responsible for supervising children from infants to 17-year-olds. Most of these positions were filled by young people in their early 20s from countries like Jamaica, Honduras, and the Philippines. They were hired through recruitment agencies that specialized in providing cruise ship entertainment staff, and they typically worked 10 months contracts with very little time off. During my third week aboard the ship, I began to notice some disturbing patterns in how the youth programs operated. The younger staff members, particularly those working with children under 12, seemed nervous and exhausted beyond what their job duties would normally require. They worked incredibly long hours, often from 7 o'clock in the morning until midnight with only short breaks for meals. When I asked about their schedules, I was told that youth staff were expected to be available whenever children were in their programs, which was essentially all day and into the evening. What concerned me more was the living arrangements for these staff members. While regular crew members shared cabins with one or two roommates, the youth program workers were housed in cramped quarters on one of the lowest decks of the ship. These rooms had no windows or ventilation, and housed up to 6 people in spaces designed for 4. The workers were not allowed to leave these quarters except when working or eating in the crew mess hall, and they were specifically prohibited from using passenger areas even when off duty. The breakthrough came when I was working late one evening and decided to check on the youth facilities before heading to my cabin. It was around 11:30 at night, well past the time when all youth programs were supposed to be closed. As I walked through the kids' club area, I heard voices coming from one of the activity rooms that should have been empty. When I investigated, I found 3 young male staff members with a group of children who appeared to be between 8 and 12 years old. The scene was immediately disturbing. The children were not dressed in their regular clothes, but were wearing what appeared to be costumes or uniforms that were inappropriate for their age. The staff members were taking photographs of the children in various poses, and there was an adult passenger present who was not supposed to have access to youth areas after hours. When the staff members noticed me, they quickly shut off the lights and began ushering the children out of the room through a service exit I had not known existed. I confronted the staff members about what was happening, but they claimed they were just preparing for a special entertainment show and that the passenger was a guest performer. However, their explanations did not make sense, and the children I had seen looked confused and upset rather than excited about participating in any kind of show. The adult passenger left immediately without identifying himself, and the staff members refused to provide any details about the supposed performance they were preparing. The next morning, I reported what I had witnessed to the cruise director, who was responsible for all entertainment programming aboard the ship. His reaction was not what I expected. Instead of being concerned about the inappropriate after-hours activity, he seemed annoyed that I had been in the youth area so late at night. He suggested that I had misunderstood what I was seeing, and that special entertainment preparation often required unusual scheduling and costumes. When I pressed for more information about the specific show the children were supposedly preparing for, the cruise director became evasive and told me that entertainment programming was confidential and that I did not need to know details about activities outside my specific area of responsibility. He also made it clear that discussing what I thought I had seen with other staff members or passengers would be a violation of my employment contract and could result in immediate termination. Over the following weeks, I became more observant of the youth programs and noticed several other concerning patterns. Certain children, particularly those traveling with single parents or in groups without close adult supervision, seemed to receive special attention from the youth staff. These children were often invited to participate in exclusive activities that were not listed in the regular program schedules, and they sometimes disappeared from group activities for extended periods without explanation. I also noticed that some of the younger youth staff members appeared to be under extreme stress beyond what their demanding work schedules would normally cause. They often had bruises or marks on their arms and faces which they claimed were from accidents during activities. However, the frequency and location of these injuries suggested something more sinister was happening. The most disturbing discovery came when I accidentally accessed a restricted area of the ship's computer system while updating activity schedules. I found files containing photographs and videos of children in the youth programs, but these images were not the typical promotional materials used by the cruise line. The children in these files were photographed in inappropriate situations and poses, and some of the images appeared to have been taken in private cabin areas rather than public youth facilities. When I tried to report this discovery to ship security, I was told that all computer files were confidential and that accessing restricted systems was a serious violation of company policy. The security officer who took my report seemed more concerned about my unauthorized computer access than about the inappropriate images I had found. He warned me that making false accusations about ship operations could result in criminal charges against me when we returned to port. I learned later from a former youth staff member who had left the cruise industry that what I had witnessed was part of a larger exploitation network that operated on multiple ships. According to this individual, children in youth programs were sometimes selected for special activities that involved inappropriate photographing and interaction with adult passengers who paid substantial amounts of money for access to these illegal services. The network operated by identifying vulnerable children whose parents or guardians were less likely to notice their absence or ask questions about their activities. single parents, who were drinking heavily, or couples who spent most of their time in adult areas of the ship were preferred targets, because their children were essentially unsupervised for long periods. The youth staff members were often trafficked themselves and were forced to participate in the exploitation under threat of violence or abandonment at foreign ports. The cruise line provided perfect cover for these operations, because parents assumed their children were safe in supervised programs, and the ship's movement through international waters made investigation and prosecution extremely difficult. Children who tried to report inappropriate treatment were told that no one would believe them, and parents who raised concerns were often dismissed or told their children were causing problems and would be removed from the programs. The most heartbreaking aspect of this situation was that many of the youth staff members were victims themselves. They had been recruited from impoverished backgrounds with promises of good jobs in the entertainment industry, only to find themselves trapped in situations where they were forced to facilitate the abuse of children or face severe consequences. Their own exploitation made them unwilling and unreliable witnesses, even when they wanted to protect the children in their care. After leaving the cruise industry, I attempted to report what I had witnessed to federal authorities, but the international nature of cruise operations made prosecution challenging. The FBI took my report seriously, but explained that crimes occurring in international waters fell under complex jurisdictional rules, and that building cases against cruise ship operations required extensive cooperation from multiple agencies and countries. I was also contacted by attorneys representing families whose children had been abused during cruise vacations, but these cases rarely resulted in successful prosecutions. The cruise lines had extensive legal teams and insurance policies designed to minimize their liability for criminal activities aboard their ships. Victims and their families often faced years of legal battles with uncertain outcomes, while the perpetrators continued to operate with relative impunity. The exploitation of children in cruise ship youth programs represents one of the most disturbing aspects of human trafficking in the maritime industry. The combination of vulnerable children, trapped staff members, and inadequate oversight creates perfect conditions for predators to operate. Parents who entrust their children to these programs have no way of knowing that their vacation could turn into a nightmare that affects their children for the rest of their lives. What makes this situation particularly tragic is that it could be prevented with proper oversight and protection measures. However, the cruise industry's focus on profits and the complex international legal environment in which they operate means that meaningful reform is unlikely without sustained pressure from law enforcement and the public. The children I witnessed being exploited aboard the Paradise Explorer deserve better protection, and their experiences serve as a warning to parents about the hidden dangers that can exist even in seemingly safe family environments. The youth staff members who were forced to participate in these crimes were also victims who deserved rescue and support, rather than punishment. Many of them were trapped in cycles of exploitation that began with false promises of legitimate employment and continued through threats and coercion that made escape nearly impossible. Their stories highlight how human trafficking often involves multiple layers of victimization that can be difficult for outsiders to understand or address effectively. Music. This happened during an investigation I conducted in the fall of 2020 while working as a maritime safety inspector for a federal agency. What I discovered in the galley operations of the Grand Paradise cruise ship exposed a systematic trafficking operation that had been operating for years, hidden beneath the surface of what passengers believed was a luxury dining experience. I had been assigned to conduct a routine inspection of the ship's food service operations following passenger complaints about food quality in several cases of food poisoning that had been reported during previous voyages. The inspection was supposed to focus on sanitation procedures and food storage protocols, but what I found was far more disturbing than contaminated lettuce or improperly stored meat. The Grand Paradise was a mid-tier cruise ship that operated 7-day Caribbean itineraries and could accommodate approximately 3,000 passengers. The ship featured multiple dining venues, including a main dining room, specialty restaurants, buffet areas, and room service operations that required around-the-clock food preparation. This meant the galley operations employed nearly 200 workers across different shifts and departments. During my initial walkthrough of the main galley, I noticed several things that seemed unusual for a legitimate food service operation. The workers appeared to be predominantly young men from Southeast Asian countries, particularly Myanmar and Cambodia. They worked in complete silence, kept their heads down, and showed obvious signs of fear when supervisors approached. Most concerning was their physical appearance. Many appeared malnourished and exhausted with visible injuries, including burns, cuts, and bruises that seemed inconsistent with normal kitchen accidents. When I attempted to speak with some of the workers during my inspection, they either pretended not to understand English or looked terrified and immediately sought permission from supervisors before responding to even basic questions about food safety procedures. This behavior was highly unusual because food service workers are typically eager to demonstrate their knowledge and compliance with safety regulations. During inspections, the breakthrough came when I was inspecting the cold storage areas in the lower levels of the ship. I had gotten separated from my escort and was examining the walk-in freezers when I heard voices coming from what appeared to be a storage room adjacent to the main cold storage area. When I investigated, I found 12 men crowded into a space that was barely large enough for 4 people. They were sleeping on thin mats on the metal floor, and the room had no proper ventilation, lighting, or sanitation facilities. The men were clearly terrified when they saw me, and several began speaking rapidly in what I later learned was Burmese. One of the men, who appeared to be in his early 20s, spoke enough English to communicate with me. He told me that they were galley workers who lived in this storage room and others like it throughout the lower levels of the ship. They worked 18-hour shifts in the kitchens with no breaks except for meals, and they were never allowed to leave the galley areas or interact with passengers or other crew members. According to this worker, whose name was A, the men had been recruited in Myanmar by agents who promised them legitimate jobs on cruise ships with good wages and the opportunity to send money home to their families. They had paid substantial fees to these agents, often borrowing money against their family land or possessions to afford the recruitment costs. Once they arrived at the ship, however, their passports were immediately confiscated and they were told they owed thousands of dollars for transportation, housing, food, and other expenses. The workers were trapped in a system of debt bondage where they were required to work without wages until their debts were paid off. However, the debts kept growing because they were charged for their accommodation in the storage rooms, their meals of leftover food, and even for the privilege of working in the galley. No matter how many hours they worked, they were told they still owed money and could not leave until their debts were satisfied. Ang explained that the workers were divided into different groups based on their skills and the areas where they worked. Some prepared vegetables and basic ingredients for the main kitchens. Others worked in the dishwashing areas, and a few were assigned to clean the galley equipment and floors. All of them worked under the supervision of crew members who were part of the trafficking operation and who used physical violence and threats to maintain control. The most disturbing aspect of what Aong told me was that workers who became injured or sick were not provided with medical care. Instead, they were forced to continue working regardless of their condition, and those who became too sick to work were sometimes disposed of. During port stops, he described seeing co-workers who had suffered severe burns or injuries simply disappear and being told that they had been transferred to other ships or sent home, though none of the workers believed these explanations. When I asked about the food service operations that passengers experienced, he described a system where the trafficked workers did all the dangerous and labor-intensive preparation work while legitimate crew members served the food and interacted with passengers. The trafficked workers prepared thousands of meals each day under dangerous conditions with inadequate safety equipment, but they remained completely invisible to the passengers who enjoyed the finished products. I immediately contacted my supervisory office to report what I had discovered, but I was told to complete my routine inspection first and document the trafficking evidence separately. This decision proved to be a mistake because word of my discovery had somehow reached the trafficking supervisors. And when I returned to the storage areas later that day, all the workers had been moved and the rooms had been cleaned and converted to legitimate storage use. The ship's management claimed that I had misunderstood what I had seen and that the men I had spoken with were legitimate crew members who were resting between shifts. They produced documentation showing that all galley workers were properly employed and housed in standard crew quarters, though they refused to allow me to interview specific workers or visit the crew housing areas that were supposedly being used. Over the following weeks, I worked with federal investigators to build a case against the trafficking operation, but the evidence proved difficult to gather. The ship operated in international waters for most of its itinerary, which complicated jurisdictional issues, and the trafficked workers had been moved to other vessels or locations before investigators could interview them. The cruise line hired expensive lawyers who argued that any labor violations were the responsibility of subcontractors, rather than the cruise line itself. The investigation revealed that the trafficking operation was much larger than what I had discovered on the Grand Paradise. The same recruitment agencies and crew management companies were placing trafficked workers on dozens of ships operated by multiple cruise lines. The workers were moved between vessels regularly to avoid detection and to prevent them from developing relationships with legitimate crew members who might report their situation. The economic model behind the operation was devastatingly effective. By using trafficked workers for the most labor-intensive and dangerous food preparation work, the cruise lines could reduce their labor costs dramatically while maintaining the appearance of professional food service operations. Passengers paid premium prices for their meals without knowing that the workers who prepared their food were essentially slaves working under conditions that violated every labor and human rights standard. The traffickers had also developed sophisticated methods for avoiding detection during inspections. They maintained false employment records for all the trafficked workers, created fake crew quarters that could be shown to inspectors, and had legitimate crew members prepared to pose as supervisors and vouch for the working conditions. The trafficked workers themselves were coached on what to say if questioned by authorities, though most were too frightened to speak honestly, even when given opportunities to seek help. What made the situation even more tragic was that the families of the trafficked workers often believed their relatives were working legitimate jobs and earning good money. The workers were occasionally allowed to make brief phone calls home where they were required to